Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 7 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Charles LEA, Book 1, Chapter 4. Establishment of the Inquisition, Part 7. That Lucero was an exceptional monster may well be admitted, but when such wickedness could be safely perpetrated for years, and only be exposed and ended through the accidental intervention of Philip and Juana, it may safely be assumed that the temptations of secrecy and irresponsibility rendered frightful abuses, if not universal, at least frequent. The brief reign of Philip led other sorely vexed communities to appeal to the sovereigns for relief, and some of their memorials have been preserved. One from Jaén relates that the tribunal of that city procured from Lucero a useful witness whom for 5 years he had kept in the prison of Cordova to swear to what was wanted. His name was Diego de Algeciras, and, if the petitioners are to be believed, he was, in addition to being a perjurer, a drunkard, a gambler, a forger, and a clipper of coins. This worthy was brought to Jaén and performed his functions so satisfactorily that the wealthiest conversos were soon imprisoned. 200 wretches crowded the filthy jail, and it was requisite to forbid the rest of the conversos from leaving the city without a license. With Diego's assistance and the free use of torture on both accused and witnesses, it was not difficult to obtain whatever evidence was desired. The notary of the tribunal, Antonio de Barcena, was especially successful in this. On one occasion he locked a young girl of 15 in a room, stripped her naked, and scourged her until she consented to bear testimony against her mother. A prisoner was carried in a chair to the auto de fe, with his feet burnt to the bone. He and his wife were burnt alive, and then 2 of their slaves were imprisoned and forced to give such evidence as was necessary to justify the execution. The cells in which the unfortunates were confined in heavy chains were narrow, dark, humid, filthy, and overrun with vermin, while their sequestrated property was squandered by the officials, so that they nearly starved in prison while their helpless children starved outside. Granting that there may be exaggeration in this, the solid substratum of truth is clear from the fact that the petitioners only asked that the tribunal be placed under the control of the Bishop of Jaén, that bishop being Alfonso Suarez de Fuentesas, one of Torquemada's inquisitors, who had risen to be a colleague of Teza. He had not been a merciful judge, as many of his sentences attest, yet the miserable conversos of Jaén were ready to fly to him for relief. A memorial from Arjona, a considerable town near Jaén, illustrates a different phase of the subject. It relates that a certain Alvaro de Escalera of that place conspired with other evil men to report to the inquisitors of Jaén that there were numerous heretics in Arjona, so that when confiscations came to be sold, they could buy the property cheap. In due time, an inquisitor came with the notary Barcena. No term of grace was given, but the edict of faith was published, frightening the inhabitants with its fulminations unless they testified against their neighbors. Then a Dominican preached a fiery sermon to the effect that all conversos were really Jews, whom it was the duty of Christians to destroy. The inquisitors then sent for the slaves of the conversos, promising them liberty if they would testify against their masters, and assuring them of secrecy. The notary followed by traversing the town with Escalera and his friends, proclaiming that there was a fine of 10 reales on all who would not come forward with testimony, and the exaction of the fine from a number had a quickening influence on the memories of others. Then a house-to-house canvass was made for evidence. The women were told that it was impossible that they should not know the Jewish tendencies of their neighbors. They could give what evidence they pleased, for their names would not be divulged. They were not obliged to prove it, for the accused had to disprove it. Those who would not talk were threatened that they would be carried to Jaén and made to accuse their neighbors, and, in fact, a number were taken and compelled to give evidence in prison. Then the inquisitors departed with the accumulated testimony, There was peace in Arjona for 3 months, and the Conversos recovered from their fright. Suddenly one night there arrived the notary, the receiver, and some officials. They quietly aroused the regidores and alcaldes and made them collect a force of armed men who were stationed to guard the walls and gates. When morning came, the work of arresting the suspects was commenced. Their property was sequestrated, their houses locked, and their children were turned into the street, while the officials carried off their prisoners, who were thrust into the already crowded jail of Jaen. The confiscations were auctioned off, and those who had plotted the raid had ample opportunity of speculating in bargains. Still other methods are detailed in a memorial from Llerena, the seat of one of the older tribunals with jurisdiction over Extremadura. It stated that for many years the Inquisition there had found little or nothing to do, until there came a new judge, the Licenciado Bravo. He was a native of Fregenal, a town of the province, where he had bitter lawsuits and active enmities. He had had 2 months' training under Lucero at Cordova, and he came armed with ample evidence gathered there. On his arrival, without waiting for formalities or further testimony, he made a large number of arrests and sent to Badajoz, where he seized 40 more and brought them to Llerena. They were mostly men of wealth whose fortunes were attractive objects of spoliation, and Bravo took care of his kindred by appointing them to positions in which they could appropriate much of the sequestrated property. The treatment of the prisoners was most brutal, and when his colleague, Inquisitor Villart, who was not wholly devoid of compassion, was overheard remonstrating with him and saying that the death of the captives would be on their souls, Bravo told him to hold his peace, for he who had placed him there desired that they should all die off, one by one. The petitioners were quite willing to be remitted to the Tribunal of Seville, or to have judges who would punish the guilty and discharge the innocent. But they earnestly begged, by the Passion of Christ, that they should not be left to the mercy of Inquisitor-General Deza. Orders, they said, had been given to him to mitigate in some degree the suffering of the people of Jaen, which he suppressed and replaced with instructions to execute justice. What this meant we may gather from a last despairing appeal by the friends of the prisoners of Jaen to Queen Juana. A junta of lawyers, they said, had been assembled. A scaffold of immense proportions was under construction. Their only hope was in her, and they entreated her to order that no auto de fe be held until impartial persons should ascertain the truth as to the miserable captives. Juana was in no condition to respond to this agonized prayer, and we may safely assume that greed and cruelty claimed their victims. These glimpses into the methods of the tribunals elucidate the statements of the Capitan Navora as to the desolation spread over the land by the Inquisition. It would seem that these fearful abuses were creating a general feeling of hostility to the institution and its officials, for Ferdinand deemed it necessary to issue a proclamation, January 19, 1510, calling upon all officials, gentlemen, and good citizens to furnish inquisitors and their subordinates with lodgings and supplies at current prices, and not to maltreat or assail them, under penalty of 50,000 maravedis and punishment at the royal discretion. A month later, February 22nd, we find him writing to the Constable of Castile that inquisitors are to visit the districts of Burgos and Calahorra, and he asks the constable to give orders that they may not be impeded. Somewhat similar instructions he gave in March to the provisor and corregidor of Cuenca, when the inquisitors of Cartagena were preparing to visit that portion of their district, as though these special interpositions of the royal power were requisite to ensure their comfort and safety in the discharge of their regular duties. Even these were sometimes ineffectual, as was experienced in 1515 by the Inquisitor Paradinas of Cartagena, who, while riding on his mule in the streets of Murcia, was set upon, stabbed, and would have been killed but for assistance, while the assassins escaped, calling forth from Ferdinand the most emphatic orders for their arrest and trial. Yet, however rudely the Inquisition may have been shaken, it was too firmly rooted in the convictions of the period and too energetically supported by Ferdinand to be either destroyed or essentially reformed. When he died, January 23, 1516, his testament, executed the day previous, laid strenuous injunctions on his grandson and successor, Charles V. As all other virtues are nothing without faith, by which and in which we are saved, we command the said illustrious prince, our grandson, to be always zealous in defending and exalting the Catholic faith, and that he aid, defend, and favor the Church of God, and labor with all his strength to destroy and extirpate heresy from our kingdoms and lordships, selecting and appointing throughout them ministers God-fearing and of good conscience, who will conduct the Inquisition justly and properly for the service of God and the exaltation of the Catholic faith, and who will also have great zeal for the destruction of the sect of Mahomet. With his death, during the absence of his successor, the governing power was lodged in the hands of Inquisitor-General Ximenes. From the papal brief of August 18, 1509, alluded to above, we may infer that he had already endeavored to effect a partial reform, by dismissing some of the more obnoxious inquisitors, and he now made use of his authority to strike at those who had hitherto been beyond his reach. Aguirre was one of these, and another was the mercenary Calcena, concerning whom he wrote to Charles, December 1516, that it was necessary that they should in future have nothing to do with the Inquisition in view of their foul excesses. Another removal, of which we chanced to have cognizance, was that of Juan Ortiz de Zarate, the secretary of the Suprema. Whatever were the failings of the inflexible Ximenes, pecuniary corruption was abhorrent to him, and, during the short term of his supremacy in Castile, we may feel assured that he showed no mercy to those who sought to coin into money the blood of the Conversos. With his death, however, came a speedy return to the bad old ways. Adrian of Utrecht, though well-intentioned, was weak and confiding. When appointed Inquisitor-General of Aragon, he had made Calcena, February 12, 1517, secretary of that Suprema, and, after the death of Ximenes, we find Calcena acting, in 1518, as royal secretary of the reunited Inquisition, a position which he shared with Hugo de Uries, Lord of Ayerbe, another appointee of Adrian's, who long retained that position under Charles V. Aguirre had the same good fortune, having been appointed by Adrian to membership in the Suprema of Aragon, and resuming his position in the reunited Inquisition after the death of Ximenes. His name occurs as signed to documents as late as 1546, when he seems to be the senior member. Ferdinand's dying exhortation to his grandson was needed. Charles V, a youth of 17, was as clay in the hands of the potter, surrounded by grasping Flemish favorites, whose sole object, as far as concerned Spain, was to sell their influence to the highest bidder. During the interval before his coming to take possession of his new dominions, he fluctuated in accordance with the pressure which happened momentarily to be strongest. The Spaniards who came to his court gave fearful accounts of the Inquisition, which they said was ruining Spain, and we are told that his counselors were mostly Conversos who had obtained their positions by purchase. In his prologue to his subsequent abortive project of reform, Charles says that while in Flanders he received many complaints about the Inquisition, which he submitted to famous men of learning and to colleges and universities, and his proposed action was in accordance with their advice. Ximenes was alive to the danger, and it was doubtless by his impulsion that the Council of Castile wrote to Charles that the peace of the kingdom and the maintenance of his authority depended on his support of the Inquisition. A more adroit maneuver was the advantage which he took of the death, June 1, 1516, of Bishop Mercader, Inquisitor-General of Aragon. It would probably not have been difficult for him to have reunited the Inquisitions of the two crowns under his own headship, but he took the more politic course of urging Charles to nominate his old tutor, Adrian of Utrecht, then in Spain, as his representative, and to secure for him the succession to Mercader's see of Tortosa. Charles willingly followed the advice. July 30th he replied that in accordance with it he had written to Rome for the commission. November 14th Pope Leo commissioned Adrian as Inquisitor-General of Aragon, and we shall see hereafter how complete was the ascendancy which he exercised over Charles in favor of the Holy Office. Meanwhile Charles continued to vacillate. At one time he proposed to banish from his court all those of Jewish blood, and sent a list of names in cipher with instructions to report their genealogies, to which the Suprema of Aragon replied, October 27, 1516, with part of the information, promising to furnish the rest, and expressing great gratification at his promises of aid and support in all things. Then there came a rumor that he proposed to abolish the suppression of the names of witnesses, which was one of the crowning atrocities of inquisitorial procedure. For this there must have been some foundation for, March 11, 1517, Ximenes sent to his secretary Ayala a commission as procurator of the Inquisition at Charles' court, with full power to resist any attempt to restrict or impede it, and he followed this, March 17th, with a letter to Charles, more vigorous than courtly, telling him that such a measure would be the destruction of the Inquisition and would cover his name with infamy. Ferdinand and Isabella, when in straits for money during the war with Granada, had refused 1,200,000 ducats for such a concession, and Ferdinand had subsequently rejected an offer of 400,000. It can readily be imagined that, in spite of the character of Ximenes, the death of Ferdinand and the uncertainty as to the views of the distant sovereign had sensibly diminished the awe felt for the Inquisition. There is an indication of this in a complaint made by the Suprema in September 1517, that when it moved with the court from place to place, the alcaldes of the palace refused to furnish mules and wagons to transport its books and papers and personnel, or at most only did so after all the other departments of the government had been supplied. There is significance also in a tumult occurring in Orihuela in 1517, when the inquisitors of Cartagena made a visitation there, obliging the licenciado Salvatierra to invoke the royal intervention. The Conversos, though decimated and impoverished, still had money and influence, and the abuses which Ximenes had not been able to eradicate still excited hostility. When Charles, after his arrival in Spain in September 1517, held his first Cortes at Valladolid in 1518, the deputies petitioned him to take such order that justice should be done by the Inquisition, so that the wicked alone should be punished and the innocent not suffer, that the canons and the common law should be observed, that the inquisitors should be of gentle blood, of good conscience and repute, and of the age required by law, and finally that episcopal ordinaries should be judges in conformity with justice. Although drawn in general terms, this formal complaint indicates that the people felt the Holy Office to be an engine of oppression for the furtherance of the private ends of the officials to the disregard of law and justice. Charles made reply that he would consult learned and saintly men, with whose advice he would so provide that injustice should cease, and meanwhile he would receive memorials as to abuses and projects of reform. The deputies made haste to give him ample information as to the tribulations of his subjects and the injury resulting to his dominions, and the outcome of the consultations of his advisers was a series of instructions to the officials of the Inquisition which, if carried into effect, would have deprived the Holy Office of much of its efficiency for persecution as well as its capacity for injustice. Peter Martyr tells us that the New Christians, to procure this, gave to the High Chancellor, Jean Le Sauvage, who was a thoroughly corrupt man, 10,000 ducats in hand, with a promise of 10,000 more when it should go into effect, but that fortunately for the Inquisition he fell sick towards the end of May and died early in July. The instructions had been finally engrossed and lacked only the signatures. They were drawn in the names of Charles and Juana and were addressed not only to the officials of the Inquisition but to those of the state and secular justice, but nothing more was heard of them, for the new chancellor, Mercurino di Gattinara, was a man of different stamp, and Charles as yet was swayed by the influences surrounding him. The elaborate project is therefore of no interest, except as an acknowledgment, in its provisions for procedure, of the iniquity of the inquisitorial process as we shall see it hereafter, and in its prohibitory clauses that existing abuses exaggerated in every way the capacity for evil of the system as practiced. Thus, It prohibited that the salaries of the inquisitors should be dependent on the confiscations and fines which they pronounced, or that grants should be made to them from confiscated property or benefices of those whom they condemned, or that sequestrated property should be granted away before the condemnation of its owners; that inquisitors and officials abusing their positions should be merely transferred to other places instead of being duly punished; that those who complained of the tribunals should be arrested and maltreated; that those who appealed to the Suprema should be maltreated; that inquisitors should give information to those seeking grants as to the property of prisoners still under trial; that prisoners under trial should be debarred from hearing mass and receiving the sacraments; that those condemned to perpetual prison should be allowed to die of starvation. The general tenor of these provisions indicate clearly what a tremendous stimulus to persecution and injustice was confiscation as a punishment of heresy. How the whole business of the Inquisition was degraded from its ostensible purpose of purifying the faith into a vile system of spoliation, and how those engaged in it were inevitably vitiated by the tempting opportunity of filthy gains. Although Charles, on the death of his chancellor, dropped the proposed reform, he seems to have recognized the existence of these evils. When his Inquisitor-General, Cardinal Adrian, was elevated to the papacy in 1522, he sent from Flanders his chamberlain, Lachoux, to congratulate him before he should leave Spain, and among the envoy's instructions was the suggestion that he should be careful in his appointments and provide proper means to prevent the Inquisition from punishing the innocent and its officials from thinking more about the property of the condemned than the salvation of their souls, a pious wish but perfectly futile so long as the methods of the institution were unchanged, and its expenses were to be met and its officials enriched by fines and confiscations. The sufferers had long recognized this, and offers had more than once been vainly made to Ferdinand to compound for the royal right of confiscation, offers of which we know no details. With the failure of the comprehensive scheme of reform, this plan was revived, and before Charles left Spain, May 21, 1520, to assume the title of King of the Romans, a formal proposition was made to him to the effect that if justice should be secured in the Inquisition, by appointing judges free from suspicion who should observe the law, so that the innocent might live secure and the wicked be punished and the papal ordinances be obeyed, there were persons who would dare to serve him as follows. Considering that greed is the parent of all evils, that it is the law of the Partidas that the property of those having Catholic children should not be confiscated, and further that the royal treasury derived very little profit from the confiscations, as they were all consumed in the salaries and costs of the judges and receivers who enriched themselves, His Majesty could well benefit himself by a composition and sale of all his rights therein, for himself and his descendants forever, obtaining from the Pope a bull prohibiting confiscations and pecuniary penances and fines. If this were done, the parties pledged themselves to provide rent sufficient, with those that Ferdinand had assigned towards that purpose, to defray all the salaries and costs of the Inquisition, on a basis to be defined by Charles. Moreover, they would pay him 400,000 ducats, 100,000 before his departure, and the balance in 3 equal annual payments at the fair of Antwerp in May. Or, if he preferred not to do this in perpetuity, he could limit the term, for which 200,000 ducats would be paid in similar 4 installments. For the collection of the sum to meet these engagements there must be letters and provisions, such as the Catholic king gave for the compositions of Andalusia, and it must be committed in Castile to the Archbishop of Toledo, Cardinal de Croy, and in Aragon to the Archbishop of Saragossa, Alfonso de Aragon, from whose decisions there was to be no appeal. But to furnish the necessary personal security for the fulfillment of this offer, it was significantly added that it would be necessary for the king and Cardinal Adrian to give safe conducts to the parties, protecting them from prosecution by the Inquisition, and this must be issued in the current month of October, so that there might be time to raise the money. It is scarce necessary to say that this proposition was unsuccessful. Charles was under the influence of Cardinal Adrian, and Adrian was controlled by his colleagues. It was asking too much of inquisitors that they should agree to allow themselves to be restricted to the impartial administration of the cruel laws against heresy, to be content with salaries and forego the opportunities of peculation. It was also in vain that the Cortes of Coruna, in 1520, repeated the request of those of Valladolid for a reform in procedure. Charles sailed for Flanders, leaving his subjects exposed to all the evils under which they had groaned so long. There were still occasional ebullitions of resistance for, in 1520, when the Tribunal of Cuenca arrested the deputy corregidor, it gave rise to serious troubles, and Inquisitor Mariano of Toledo was dispatched thither with his servants and familiars to restore peace, a task which occupied him for 5 months. End of Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 7. Recording by Shena Ser, Fresno, California.